Kristin Reimer has been very supportive of our work with RBE, and Kristin at Monash, she works to advance the idea of education as a humanising practice. Restorative Justice Education, RJE. The main focus of Kristin's work is one of such humanising approach in schools. Beyond RJE, other threads of Kristin's research and practice reinforce education as a connective endeavour. Alternative education for justice-involved youth, access to higher education for non-traditional students, experience of refugee and asylum-seeking university students, global citizenship education, and intergenerational teaching relationships. Kristin will connect RB with the two underlying purposes of education to help us to live well and to help us to create a world worth living in for all. Thanks, Kristin.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gail. And I'll just get my screen showing here. Hopefully you can see that. If not, please yell at me. It's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to be here with you today to talk about relationships. And thank you, Gail. Thank you, John. Thank you to Sharon as well. And thank you for everyone for being here. I sort of get the easy job. So John has laid out the fundamentals of what makes for a really positive and quality relationship. And I get to talk about the why. And that comes in already. We've heard about it, the reasons for why we center relationships. But I'm going to focus on three reasons. There are many, but I'm going to talk about three reasons that come out of my research, that come out of my teaching, and also come out of my personal experience as well. So the first answer to why is relationships-based education important, or why do we center relationships, is from what you've already heard, from what John spoke about so clearly, is that all education simply is relational. We know that. We know it's a social practice. And so I think it can become very common sense, though, and we sort of forget that. And so there is a need to make it explicit, to really center it in order to think through those relationships. The second reason is because we're not in this for the short term. We're not in education or in parenting just for those short-term goals. We have a long-term view of that. And those are those two goals that Gail mentioned that I'll talk about, those two purposes of education. And the third is because education has the potential to be really transformative. And the way that we get there is through the centering of those relationships. That's where that power to transform is located. So I'm going to go through each of these a little bit. And the first one is just that idea, again, that education simply is relational. It's a social practice. It's about people meeting one another in order to learn. So Bingham and Sidorkin here talk about how meeting and learning are inseparable from one another. And we know that. I mean, of course we can learn things on our own in isolation, but we're very limited in that. And so much of our learning, whether it is in the classroom, whether it is in the corridor, whether it's on the tennis court or in the playground or on the street or online as well, there is still a real social, a relational part where we offer our own understandings. We learn from interaction with we learn from others' experiences, their perspectives, our own understanding grows, and it happens as a connective activity. So education simply is relational. And yet, although it is relational, we know that the quality of what those relationships are can really be different from one interaction to another or one site to another. So all education or all relationships are not, of course, created equal. And so because of that, because relationships are not a good in and of themselves, education is inherently relational, but we need to focus on what do those relationships actually look and feel like to people. And so my background and my research, my teaching is mostly focused on restorative practice. And restorative practice is about relationships. It's about how educators in schools can create spaces that are safe, that are supportive, that are encouraging, in which students and adults can learn how to relate with one another, how to interact, and how to deal with issues when they come up. So it's based on two really important principles. And the first is that each and every person is inherently worthy. We have worth, no one's disposable. But also that it is our connections that are the most important thing. And so it's about strengthening the binds that are already there, those essential ties that bind us together. And it's about strengthening those and making those into quality ties to one another. So in a simple way, we talk about how restorative practice is about, first of all, building those quality relationships that have those 5 components that John was talking about, building them between students, building them between teacher and students, building them between teachers or other adults within the school system, but building them also within families and between families and school. Building them, and then once they're there, maintaining them, and then when things happen, as they're going to, because we are human, about repairing those. And this is a quote from Richard Hendry, which I do not think is a relation to John, but I need to check that later. So one of the first significant studies I did of restorative justice or restorative practice was looking at it in 2 different schools and looking at it from the student perspective. So learning from them how they were experiencing restorative practice in their school. So I looked at one school in Scotland and one in Canada. And what I learned from the students, was how important those relationships were and how the quality of the relationships impacted the experience of restorative practice. So both schools were doing some amazing things around restorative practice, using some of the same techniques or some of the same processes, and yet that felt really different to the students. So in the Scottish school, what I found was the relationships were mostly ones of control. So while restorative practice helped them to do things in a bit of a more of a kindler, gentler way, it was still about seeking compliant students, seeking students that obeyed the rules, and the students felt like they were being controlled in different ways. And so they were a bit confused about the whole experience of school, really. In the Canadian school, it was quite different. The relationships the students felt were ones of engagement. They used restorative practice in order to give the students voice, to deal with conflicts and the roots of conflict, and to really empower the students. And the students there, for them, school made a lot more sense. It connected their own experiences of life into that school. And so that's where I first started seeing, okay, it's all about relationships, but it's that quality of relationships that's really crucial to take a look at and to have a bit of a view and a critical sense of. So number one, why center relationships? Because education is relational, and therefore we need to look at the quality of those relationships. Number two, though, is that we know that education is not for the short term. We're not just interested in developing and helping students to grow for the end of today, or for the end of the semester, or even for the end of the year. As educators, as parents, we're in this for the long term. We're in this really for life. And so that sense of the why really gets to the purpose of education. Okay, so why do we have schools? Why do we have education? And I work with someone from Charles Sturt University, a wonderful academic called Stephen Kemmis, and some of his colleagues. And they've really talked about it in what I think is a beautiful way. They talk about a dual purpose of education. So there's 2 purposes, 2 big purposes for education. The first is that education should help us learn how to live well. And the second is that education should help us to create a world worth living in for all. And when you pair those together, how do we live well in a world worth living in for all? That's a really profound, that's a really complicated, but it's a really transformative understanding of the power of education. And it's all about relationships. It centers relationship, because how else do you live well, and how else do you create a world worth living in for all? So I, along with a number of other researchers around the world, are looking at this question. So what for our times does it actually mean to live well in a world worth living in for all? And how can education bring us there? So there's about 30 different projects around the world that are looking at this question, and all asking people that they work with in whatever realm of education they're involved with, what for you does it mean to live well? And what is a world worth living in for all? And if you're interested in this project, early next year, we're going to be bringing out the first book around this, but also a number of videos and a podcast too that helps us to understand education's role in this. But I'm going to show you one very quick video, which is from my own research in this and my own teaching, which is with the Monash Access Program. The Monash Access Program, it is it's an alternative pathway into university. It is for young people, actually they're mature age students, but most of them are young people, who have had actually some negative experiences of education in the past. Many of them have not graduated from high school, but this is a pathway into university. And they all have quite a lot of wisdom and insight to share about how they see the power of education. So I'm going to show you a few of their answers to these questions.
The world that I want to live in is just where you ask somebody what they do and they tell you, and it's a reflection of their choices rather than circumstance or where they were born or what they happen to be born into.
The students that we're hearing from today, they're all part of the Monash Access Program, an alternative entry into university. And I think it's really important that we hear from them. They're incredibly thoughtful. They have a lot of insight and wisdom to offer. And again, because they didn't come in the usual way, they don't take university for granted. They have different ideas about what education can offer us and what education can offer the world.
Having a good quality of life is what makes a life worth living in. Access to the things that you need and participating in society and equality as well.
Living a good life, it's constantly moving forward and I guess attaining your goals.
Having really strong relationships that I can either rely on in certain circumstances or contribute to in others.
A role that education plays for creating that world is really just giving people the knowledge to participate and make action possible.
And want to move forward. I feel like I was in that rut before. I was in a complacent job, and education helped me move out of that and see that there was a way for someone to move forward and to want to keep moving forward.
Being a more informed or more educated individual means that you've got more tools at your disposal to actually go and do what you set out to do.
It's hard to deny that education is just the place where you go if you want to improve. The community that's around you is all other people that are trying to improve. So it's like this feedback loop of getting this really strong community, getting this really strong foundation of like learning to learn.
Anytime I learn things, it's made me love myself and love life so much more, because life is just so not simple, but it's also so beautiful, and that's what education has taught me. People are beautiful, society is beautiful, life can be beautiful. So thanks, education, for teaching me that.
So I think hearing those ideas about what education can do to help us live well, I mean, a lot of that was about relationships, but also just that fact about coming together in relationship to learn, how that in and of itself helps us to transform ourselves and transform the world, which is my final point, which is that education has that potential to be transformative. And the image here, I won't make you guess where it is. I often do if I have enough time, but this is the place where I had my first teaching job. And this is where I learned that education has that potential to be transformative. If you're not sure where it is in Pyongyang in North Korea. That's where I first taught. And it's a very unique place to begin a teaching career, but I do often say that North Korea taught me pretty much everything that I know about teaching. It was in very constrained situation, of course. I was brought in by the North Korean government to teach English, and they were very clear that it would only be about teaching English. It was only about content. There will be no connections. There will be no relationships. And they did everything possible to make that happen, in that I was driven to the place I was teaching. I was escorted to a room outside of the room where I was teaching. The minute the teaching began, I was allowed into the room. I would teach for 3 hours. And within those 3 hours, there would be people in the room who were minders, who were taking note of everything I did and everything I said to report it to the ministry. And then at the end of those 3 hours, I was escorted out, driven back to my apartment, and kept there. And so everything was done to make sure that relationships were not formed. And yet you cannot be in a room for 3 hours a day, 5 days a week for 6 months and not form relationships. And that is the very first place where I learned how education is absolutely about relationships. But I also learned how transformative it is. So for those first 2 weeks of teaching, the trust that John was talking about, there was no trust. And so learning did not take place. But bit by bit, we began to trust one another. We began to figure out our connections with one another. And the transformative part happened for me and for them, my students, in terms of seeing our connections, the humanity, seeing our relationships, seeing the humanness of all of us, because we both came into that room with a whole lot of stereotypes about what each of us would be. And the transformative part was absolutely not in the content of what was being taught. The transformative part was in the relational part. The power of teaching is in those relationships. And of course, this is an extreme example, but what I learned from that too is that within that, there are always movements to, within those constraints, there is always movements there's always spots to move. And so we talk about constraints in all systems. And this, again, this is an extreme version, but there are constraints in the Victorian system. There's my timer, 1 minute. There are constraints in whatever state we're in, whatever region we're in Canadian school systems, in Scottish school systems, in North Korean, there's always constraints. But within that, there's always also movements. There's little, small relational steps that can be taken. So from those 3 points, then, we start with the assumption and the understanding that all education is absolutely relational. So why do we then center relationships? Because it is all relational, we need to get to that quality of relationships and understand that quality. Because the purpose of education is not about short-term goals, we need to center relationships so that we can actually get us to a place where it is good for humans, for humankind, and good for our world that we live in, so that we can form those connections and create that world worth living in. And because education has the potential to be transformative, and the transformation is in those relationships, we also need to center those relationships. Thank you very much. I think I went a couple of minutes over, but it's wonderful to talk with you. And I so look forward to hearing from the schools that are going to talk to us about the amazing things that they are doing within their schools, and then to engage with you in some questions later on as well, and some further conversation.